My wife and sister mocked my marriage behind my back. I shut down every advance unmasked manipulation and drove an intruder out of our family home. Every Sunday, we had the same ritual, family dinner at my in-laws' house, complete with dry conversation, overcooked roast, and my father-in-law's endless stories about his glory days playing high school football. But this particular Sunday changed everything when I overheard my wife telling her sister exactly what she thought about our marriage. I was heading to the bathroom when I caught their voices drifting from the kitchen. My wife was washing dishes, and her sister was leaning against the counter with that smug expression she always wore. They thought they were alone. They thought wrong. "Honestly, he just doesn't satisfy me anymore," my wife said, her voice carrying that familiar tone of complaint. "I mean, he tries, but it's just boring, predictable. No passion, no excitement." I froze in the hallway, my jaw clenching. 3 years of marriage, and this is how she talks about me behind my back, to her sister, of all people. But what came next made my blood boil even more. Her sister laughed, a sound that was equal parts amusement and malice. "Well, if he can't handle you properly, maybe he needs someone who knows what they're doing." She paused, letting her words hang in the air before delivering the knockout punch. "I bet he'd satisfy me just fine." The silence that followed was deafening. I could practically hear my wife's shock through the wall. "What did you just say?" my wife whispered, her voice tight with disbelief. "You heard me," her sister replied, completely unbothered. "You're always complaining about him. But maybe the problem isn't him. Maybe it's you." I had heard enough. Instead of barging in there like some emotional wreck, I took a deep breath and made a calculated decision. I walked back to the living room, sat down in my chair, and started planning my response. Because if there's one thing I've learned in life, it's that the best revenge is served cold, calculated, and with surgical precision. When they both returned to the living room 10 minutes later, the atmosphere had shifted completely. My wife looked uncomfortable, avoiding eye contact with everyone, while her sister wore that same smug smile, now directed at me. "How's everyone doing?" I asked, keeping my voice casual as I looked directly at my sister-in-law. "You two seem to be having quite the conversation in there." My wife's face went pale, but her sister just shrugged. "Just girl talk. Nothing you'd be interested in." "Oh, I don't know about that," I replied, my tone perfectly neutral but with just enough edge to make them both shift uncomfortably. "I find conversations about satisfaction pretty interesting, don't you?" The word satisfaction hit like a brick. My wife's eyes went wide, and for the first time since I'd known her, her sister looked genuinely rattled. "What do you mean by that?" my wife asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I leaned back in my chair, completely relaxed, completely in control. "Nothing specific. Just that satisfaction is such a personal thing, don't you think? What satisfies one person might not satisfy another, and sometimes people think they know what would satisfy them, but they're completely wrong." Her sister recovered quickly, but I caught the brief moment of uncertainty that flashed across her face. "That's an interesting perspective," she said. "I have lots of interesting perspectives," I replied, looking straight at her, especially about people who make assumptions about things they know nothing about. The rest of dinner was a masterclass in tension. Every word I spoke seemed to carry a double meaning. Every glance was loaded with implication. I watched as both women tried to navigate the minefield I'd created, neither sure how much I actually knew. My father-in-law, blissfully unaware of the undercurrents, continued his rambling stories while my mother-in-law fussed over dessert. But the three of us were playing a completely different game now. As we prepared to leave, my sister-in-law made one final attempt to regain her footing. "We should have you both over for dinner next week," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I'd love to show you some of my cooking skills." I smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't reach your eyes. "That sounds interesting. I'm always curious to see what people bring to the table." My wife grabbed my arm a little too tightly as we walked to the car. She was quiet during the entire drive home, stealing nervous glances at me every few minutes. She knew something had shifted, but she couldn't figure out exactly what. When we finally pulled into our driveway, she broke the silence. "You seem different tonight. Is everything okay?" I turned off the engine and looked at her with the same calm expression I'd maintained all evening. "Everything's fine. Why would you think otherwise?" "I don't know. You just seemed like you were saying things with hidden meanings or something." "Hidden meanings?" I chuckled, but there was no warmth in it. I was just making conversation. "Maybe you're reading too much into things." She studied my face, searching for something she couldn't quite identify. Maybe, she said, but her voice suggested she didn't believe it for a second. As we walked into the house, I could see the wheels turning in her head. She was trying to piece together the evening, trying to figure out if her worst fears were justified. The paranoia was already setting in, and that was exactly where I wanted her. The next few days were a study in behavioral psychology, and I was the scientist observing my subjects. My wife had become hypervigilant, analyzing every word I said, every expression on my face. She was looking for confirmation that I'd overheard their kitchen conversation, but I wasn't about to give her that satisfaction. Instead, I did something far more effective. I started treating her exactly how she deserved to be treated. Tuesday morning, she made her usual complaint about the coffee being too strong. Instead of my typical response of making a fresh pot, I simply looked at her over my newspaper and said, "Then make it yourself next time. I'm not here to satisfy every little preference you have." The word satisfy hung in the air like a loaded weapon. She stared at me, coffee cup halfway to her lips, trying to decode whether that was intentional or coincidental. "I was just saying," she started. "I know exactly what you were saying," I interrupted, folding my newspaper with deliberate precision. "The question is, do you know what I'm saying?" She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. Smart choice. Wednesday brought an unexpected visit from her sister. She showed up around lunchtime, claiming she was in the neighborhood and thought she'd drop by, but I knew better. She was testing the waters, trying to gauge how much damage had been done. "Your husband's not home, is he?" she asked, the moment my wife opened the door. "Actually, I work from home on Wednesdays," I said, opening the front door wider before my wife could answer. "But please come in. I'd love to have a conversation." The look on her face was priceless. She'd clearly hoped to find my wife alone, probably to strategize or do damage control. Instead, she was walking straight into the lion's den. "Oh," she said, her confident demeanor faltering slightly. "I didn't realize you'd be here." "My house, my schedule," I replied with a smile that could cut glass. "But I'm glad you stopped by. We should talk more often, Dawn 16, you think? Really get to know each other better." My wife looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. Her sister, meanwhile, was trying to regain her composure, but I could see the uncertainty in her eyes. "So," I said, settling into my chair while they sat awkwardly on the couch. "What brings you by today? Something important you needed to discuss with your sister? Just catching up?" She replied, her voice less steady than usual. "Catching up." "Catching up," I repeated, nodding thoughtfully. "That's nice. Family should stay connected, share thoughts, feelings, opinions about each other's lives." I paused, letting that sink in, although sometimes those conversations can get a bit too personal, don't you think? My wife's face had gone 3 shades paler. Her sister, however, seemed to be finding her footing again. "I think honesty between family members is important," she said, lifting her chin defiantly. "Sometimes people need to hear the truth, even if it's uncomfortable." "Absolutely," I agreed, leaning forward slightly. "Honesty is crucial. For instance, if someone thought they knew something about someone else's life, they should probably make sure they actually know what they're talking about before making assumptions." "What kind of assumptions?" she challenged. "Oh, you know, like assuming someone isn't capable of something just because they haven't seen it firsthand or thinking they could do better without actually being tested." I smiled, and this time it was genuinely amused. People who make those kinds of assumptions usually end up disappointed. The silence that followed was electric. My wife was gripping the arm of the couch so tightly her knuckles were white, while her sister stared at me with a mixture of intrigue and apprehension. "That's an interesting way to look at it," her sister finally said. "I'm an interesting guy," I replied, full of surprises. "Isn't that right, honey?" My wife just nodded mutely. Her sister stayed for another 20 minutes, but the dynamic had completely shifted. Every attempt she made to steer the conversation toward safer territory, I redirected back to themes of assumption, satisfaction, and knowing one's place. By the time she left, she looked like she'd been through a psychological obstacle course. "What was that about?" my wife asked the moment the door closed. "What was what about?" I replied innocently. "I was just being friendly to your sister. Isn't that what you want?" "That didn't feel friendly. That felt like you were playing some kind of game with her." "Game?" I laughed, but it was cold. "I don't play games. Games are for people who aren't sure of themselves. I know exactly who I am and what I'm capable of." That night, my wife was restless. She kept looking at me with a mixture of confusion and something else I couldn't quite identify. Fear, respect, maybe both. "Can I ask you something?" she said as we were getting ready for bed. Are you okay with us? With our marriage?" The question hung in the air. This was her fishing expedition, trying to figure out how much trouble she was really in. "Why would you ask that?" I said, turning to face her fully. "Is there something about our marriage that you think needs to be discussed? Sometimes I feel like maybe we're not as connected as we used to be." "Connected," I repeated, savoring the word. "That's an interesting choice of words. What kind of connection are you looking for exactly?" She fumbled for an answer, clearly realizing she was walking through a minefield. "I don't know, just more communication maybe." "Communication is definitely important," I agreed. "But it has to go both ways. And it has to be honest, really honest. No talking behind backs, no sharing private matters with people who have no business knowing about them." Her eyes went wide. There it was, confirmation that I knew something, even if I wasn't spelling it out explicitly. "I would never," she started. "Wouldn't you?" I interrupted, my voice quiet but carrying absolute authority. "Because if you did, that would be a problem, a big problem, the kind of problem that changes everything." She stared at me, and for the first time since I'd known her, I saw genuine respect in her eyes. Not the casual fondness of a comfortable marriage, but actual respect for a man who wouldn't be pushed around. "I understand," she whispered. "Good," I said, turning back to the mirror. "Understanding is the first step towards satisfaction." Friday afternoon brought news that would test everyone's limits. My wife hung up the phone and turned to me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "My sister's apartment is being fumigated," she said carefully. She asked if she could stay with us for a few days. I set down my coffee and looked at her with raised eyebrows. "Fumigated? How convenient." "It's not convenient at all," she protested, but her voice lacked conviction. "She really doesn't have anywhere else to go." "Of course she doesn't," I said, my tone dripping with sarcasm. "And you already told her yes, didn't you?" The guilty look on her face confirmed it. I couldn't just leave her hanging. "No," I agreed, standing up and walking toward her. "But you could have asked your husband first. You know, the person who actually lives here and pays the bills." She stepped back instinctively. "I'm sorry, I should have asked. Do you want me to call her back?" "No need," I interrupted, my voice calm but commanding. "Let her come. This should be interesting." My wife's sister arrived that evening with enough luggage for a month, not a few days. She waltzed into our house like she owned the place, immediately making herself comfortable on our couch and reaching for the remote control. "Thanks for letting me crash here," she said, but her tone suggested she expected it rather than appreciated it. "I promise I won't be any trouble." "Oh, I'm sure you won't be," I replied, taking the remote from her hand before she could turn on the TV. "Because this is my house, and trouble isn't something I tolerate." She blinked, clearly not expecting such a direct response. "I just meant—" "I know what you meant," I said, maintaining eye contact. "And I'm telling you what I mean. My house, my rules, my comfort comes first. We clear on that?" My wife looked mortified, but her sister's expression was more complex. There was surprise, yes, but also something else. Intrigue, challenge accepted. "Crystal clear," she said, but there was a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. The first night was a careful dance of boundaries and testing. During dinner, she made several attempts to insert herself into conversations between my wife and me, each time redirecting attention to herself. But I wasn't having it. "Actually," I said, cutting her off mid-sentence, as she tried to hijack a story my wife was telling. "I'd like to hear the rest of what my wife was saying. You can tell us about your exciting day at the mall afterward." My wife looked shocked that I'd defended her, while her sister looked like she'd been slapped, but she recovered quickly, leaning back in her chair with that familiar, challenging expression. "Of course," she said. "I wouldn't want to interrupt anything important between you two." The way she emphasized important made it clear she was throwing down a gauntlet. Two could play that game. "Good," I replied smoothly. "Because what's between my wife and me is definitely important. More important than some people seem to realize." Saturday morning brought the real test. I was in the kitchen making breakfast when she appeared in a robe that was barely appropriate for mixed company. She leaned against the counter, positioning herself where I'd have to look at her. "You're up early," she said, her voice carrying that husky morning tone that was obviously calculated. I'm always up early, I replied without looking up from the stove. Discipline is important. Discipline, she repeated, moving closer. I like that in a man. I turned to face her then, my expression completely neutral. Do you? Because disciplined men don't fall for obvious games. She tilted her head, pretending confusion. Games? I'm just trying to be friendly. No, I said, stepping closer until she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. You're trying to prove something. But here's the thing about proof. It only works when the other person cares about your hypothesis. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked genuinely flustered. I don't know what you mean. Sure you do, I said, turning back to the stove. You're testing boundaries that don't exist, trying to create drama where there isn't any. But I'm not your audience, and this isn't your stage. She stood there for a moment, clearly not sure how to respond. Finally, she muttered something about getting coffee and left the kitchen. But she wasn't done. If anything, my rejection had intensified her efforts. Throughout the day, she found excuses to be near me, to brush against me, to make comments with double meanings. And every time, I shut her down with surgical precision. Could you help me reach something on the high shelf? She asked, positioning herself so I'd have to get close to her. Your sister can help you, I replied without moving. She's tall enough. I was thinking of ordering pizza for dinner. What do you like on yours? She asked, leaning over the table in a way that was clearly intended to be provocative. I don't eat pizza, I lied smoothly. Too greasy. Lacks discipline. By Sunday evening, the dynamic in the house had shifted dramatically. My wife was watching our interactions with growing unease, while her sister was becoming increasingly frustrated with her inability to get a rise out of me. You're really hard to read, she said during a moment when my wife was in the bathroom. Am I? I replied, not looking up from my book. Or maybe you're just not as good at reading people as you think you are. Most men are pretty simple to figure out. Most men, I agreed. But I'm not most men. She sat down across from me, her expression serious for once. No, you're not. You're different from what I expected. And what did you expect? She was quiet for a moment, clearly debating how honest to be. Someone easier to manipulate. The honesty was refreshing, if nothing else. Well, at least you're being direct now. Does that bother you, that I tried to manipulate you? I closed my book and looked at her directly. It bothers me that you thought you could. It bothers me that you think so little of your sister's husband. But mostly it bothers me that you're the kind of person who would even try. She flinched like I'd slapped her. That's harsh. Truth usually is, I said, standing up. But here's another truth for you. Whatever game you think you're playing it alone. I'm not interested. I'm not tempted. And I'm not impressed. When my wife returned, she found her sister staring at the floor and me calmly reading my book as if nothing had happened. Everything okay? She asked, sensing the tension. Everything's perfect, I said, not looking up. Your sister was just telling me how much she appreciates our hospitality. My wife looked between us, confusion written all over her face. Her sister just nodded mutely. That night, as we got ready for bed, my wife couldn't contain her curiosity any longer. What's going on between you and my sister? Nothing's going on, I said truthfully. That's the point. She seems different since she's been here, more subdued. Maybe she's learning something, I suggested, about boundaries, about respect, about the difference between wanting something and being able to get it. My wife stared at me, and I could see the wheels turning in her head. She was starting to understand that the man she'd been taking for granted was not the pushover she'd assumed him to be. How long did she say the fumigation would take? I asked casually. She didn't actually give me a specific time frame. Interesting, I said, turning off the light. Well, she'll figure it out soon enough. Monday evening brought another family dinner invitation. This time for my mother-in-law celebrating my father-in-law's retirement. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. My wife's sister had been staying with us for 4 days, and the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. We should all go together, my wife's sister suggested as we prepared to leave. I'll sit in the back. Actually, I said, grabbing my keys, I think it would be better if you rode with your sister. Give you two some time to catch up. The look that passed between the sisters told me everything I needed to know. My wife was terrified about what her sister might say, while her sister looked like she was weighing her options. That's a great idea, her sister said with renewed confidence. We do have so much to talk about. At dinner, I positioned myself strategically across from both sisters with a clear view of the entire table. My mother-in-law had gone all out, inviting aunts, uncles, and cousins I'd barely met. Perfect audience for what I had planned. The conversation flowed normally for the first hour. Work, weather, my father-in-law's retirement plans. But I was patient, waiting for the right opening. It came when my wife's cousin started talking about her recent marriage troubles. "I just feel like we're not connecting anymore," she was saying. "Like he doesn't really hear me when I talk." "That's so common in marriages," my wife chimed in, seemingly forgetting where she was. "Sometimes you need to be more direct about what you need, more honest about what's not working." I set down my fork carefully and looked at her with raised eyebrows. "Honest. That's interesting advice coming from you." The table went quiet. My wife's face drained of color as she realized what she'd walked into. "What do you mean by that?" my mother-in-law asked, sensing drama. "Oh, just that my wife has some very strong opinions about honesty in marriage," I said, my tone conversational but loaded with meaning. "Don't you, honey? Especially when it comes to discussing personal matters." My wife looked like she wanted to disappear. Her sister, meanwhile, was watching the exchange with growing alarm. "I think everyone has opinions about marriage," my wife said carefully. "True," I agreed. "But not everyone shares those opinions with, how should I put this, inappropriate audiences." The silence that followed was deafening. Every pair of eyes at the table was fixed on us. Sensing that something significant was happening but not sure what, my wife's sister tried to intervene. "I think you're making something out of nothing." "Am I?" I turned my attention to her, my smile cold as ice. "Because I have a very good memory for conversations, especially ones about satisfaction, disappointment, and people making assumptions about their abilities." Her face went pale. She knew exactly what conversation I was referencing. "I don't know what you think you heard," she started, but I cut her off. "I know exactly what I heard," I said, my voice carrying across the table. "Would you like me to share it with everyone? Because I remember every word." My wife grabbed my arm. "Please don't. Don't." "What?" I asked, looking at her with mock innocence. "Don't tell your family about how you and your sister like to discuss the intimate details of our marriage? About how you think I'm boring and predictable? About how your sister thinks she could do better?" The gasps around the table were audible. My mother-in-law's face went through several expressions before settling on outrage. "What?" my mother-in-law demanded, staring at her daughters. My wife's sister tried to backtrack. "It wasn't like that. He's twisting things around." "Am I?" I asked, pulling out my phone. "Because I have a recording app that I sometimes use for work calls. Would you like me to check if I accidentally left it running during any of our recent conversations?" I didn't actually have a recording, but they didn't know that. The bluff worked perfectly. "You recorded us?" my wife whispered, horrified. "I record lots of things," I said ambiguously. "Important conversations, significant moments, times when people think they're speaking privately but forget that walls have ears." My father-in-law, who'd been quietly observing, finally spoke up. "What exactly did they say about you, son?" This was the moment I'd been building toward. They had a very enlightening discussion about my performance as a husband. My wife shared some very personal criticisms, and her sister offered some very inappropriate alternatives. The explosion was immediate. My mother-in-law started yelling at both her daughters, demanding to know how they could be so disrespectful. Various aunts and uncles chimed in with their own opinions about marriage loyalty and family boundaries. In the chaos, I remained perfectly calm, occasionally adding fuel to the fire with carefully timed comments. "The worst part," I said during a brief lull in the shouting, "is that it happened in my own house, at my own dinner table, while I was being nothing but respectful to family." "That's despicable," my father-in-law said, looking at his daughters with disgust. "A man's home should be his sanctuary." My wife was crying now, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of humiliation and rage. Her sister looked like she wanted to disappear entirely. "I think," my mother-in-law said coldly, "that both of you owe him a public apology." "Mom, please," my wife started. "No," her mother cut her off. "You embarrassed this family. You disrespected your husband in the worst possible way. You will apologize, and you will mean it." My wife's sister tried one last desperate play. "He's not innocent in this. He's been playing games all week, making inappropriate comments." "Inappropriate comments?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Like what? Defending my marriage? Setting boundaries in my own home? Refusing to tolerate disrespect?" "You know what you did," she said weakly. "I know exactly what I did," I agreed. "I acted like a man who has self-respect. Maybe that's unfamiliar territory for you." The room erupted again. this time with several male relatives expressing their support for my position. My wife's sister found herself completely isolated, with even her own mother now viewing her as the villain in this story. "I think it's time for you to leave," my father-in-law told his younger daughter. "Find somewhere else to stay tonight." "Dad, you can't be serious." The next morning, I woke up to the smell of bacon and eggs. Real breakfast, not the usual toast and coffee my wife typically threw together. She was standing at the stove in a dress I hadn't seen her wear in months, her hair done, makeup applied. She looked like she was trying to audition for the role of devoted wife. "Good morning," she said softly when I entered the kitchen. "I made your favorite." I poured myself coffee and sat down at the table without responding. She placed the plate in front of me with shaking hands, then hovered nearby like she was waiting for approval. "Sit down," I said finally, not looking up from my food. She sat across from me, fidgeting with her napkin. "About last night." "What about it?" "I want to apologize, really apologize. Not because my mother made me, but because I know I was wrong." I took a sip of coffee and studied her face. The tears were gone, replaced by something I hadn't seen in years, genuine remorse mixed with fear. "You were wrong about what, exactly?" "Everything," she said quickly. "Talking about our marriage like that, letting her say those things about you, disrespecting you in our own home. And?" I looked at her, waiting. She looked confused. "And? I'm sorry?" "That's not what I'm looking for," I said, setting down my fork. "What else were you wrong about?" She stared at me, clearly struggling to understand what I wanted to hear. "You were wrong about me," I continued when she didn't respond. "Wrong about what I'm capable of. Wrong about what I'll tolerate. Wrong about thinking you could treat me like some doormat who'd just take whatever you dished out." "You're right," she whispered. "I know I'm right, but knowing and proving are different things. Last night proved it to everyone, including you." She nodded miserably. "What do you want from me?" "I want respect," I said simply. "Real respect. Not the fake politeness you give strangers, but actual recognition that I'm a man worth respecting. You have that." "Do I?" "Because yesterday you were still defending your sister, still making excuses, still trying to minimize what you both did." She was quiet for a long moment. "You're right. I was still trying to save face instead of owning my mistakes. And your sister, she's not welcome here anymore." "Good start. What else?" "I don't know what else you want me to say." I leaned back in my chair, watching her carefully. "I want you to understand something. The man you were married to before this week, that version of me is gone. He was too patient, too willing to overlook disrespect for the sake of keeping peace." Her eyes widened slightly. "This version doesn't tolerate that. This version expects to be treated like a king in his own castle. This version doesn't ask for respect. He demands it." "I understand." "Do you?" "Because understanding means action, not just words. It means never speaking about our private life to anyone without my permission. It means checking with me before making decisions that affect our home. It means treating me like the head of this household, not your roommate." She swallowed hard. "Those are big changes." "They're not changes," I corrected. "They're how things should have been all along. I'm just finally enforcing standards that should have been obvious." My phone rang then, interrupting the conversation. It was her sister. "Answer it," I told my wife. "Put it on speaker." She hesitated, then did as instructed. "Hello." Her sister's voice came through shaky and desperate. "I need to talk to you. Can you meet me for coffee? I'm having breakfast with my husband right now. Please, I need to explain. What happened last night was insane. He completely twisted everything around and made me look like some kind of villain." I gestured for my wife to respond. "You made yourself look like a villain," my wife said quietly. "What you said about my husband was completely inappropriate, but you agreed with me. You were complaining about him too." "That's between me and my husband now," my wife replied, her voice getting stronger. "And frankly, I don't think we should be talking anymore." The silence on the other end was telling. "You can't be serious," her sister finally said. "I'm very serious. You crossed a line that shouldn't be crossed, and now there are consequences. He's controlling you. Can't you see that?" I reached for the phone. "No, I'm teaching her what self-respect looks like, something you clearly never learned. You bastard. You ruined my relationship with my entire family." "Your mouth ruined your relationship with your family," I replied calmly. "I just made sure everyone heard what you really think about the people who matter to you." The line went dead. My wife stared at the phone, then at me. "She's going to hate me forever." "Probably." Does that bother you? She considered the question seriously. Less than I thought it would. Good answer. We finished breakfast in comfortable silence. When she got up to clear the dishes, I caught her hand. This doesn't fix everything, I said. Trust is earned back slowly. I know, but it's a start. She squeezed my hand gently. Thank you for not giving up on us. Don't thank me yet, I replied. Thank me when you've proven you deserve a second chance. 3 weeks later, the transformation was remarkable. My wife had completely changed her approach to our marriage, treating me with genuine respect and deference. She asked before making plans, consulted me on household decisions, and never once complained about my expectations. More importantly, she'd cut all contact with her sister. The real test came when my mother-in-law called to invite us to her birthday dinner. Will she be there? I asked when my wife told me about the invitation. Mom says no. She's still not speaking to either of us after what happened. Good. Then we'll go. The dinner was a study in family dynamics. My wife's relatives treated me with newfound respect. Several of the men commented approvingly on how I'd handled the situation. My father-in-law pulled me aside during cocktails. I owe you an apology, he said. I should have seen what was happening and put a stop to it myself. You couldn't have known, I replied diplomatically. Maybe not, but I know now. And I want you to know that what you did took real character. Lesser men would have just walked away. Lesser men don't know their worth, I said simply. As we were preparing to leave, my mother-in-law approached us with tears in her eyes. I'm so ashamed of how my daughters treated you, she said. You didn't deserve any of that. It's in the past, I told her. Is it though? Really? I looked at my wife, who was watching our exchange carefully. That depends on your daughter. She's making the right choices now. My mother-in-law hugged me then, whispering, "Thank you for not giving up on her." On the drive home, my wife was unusually quiet. What's on your mind? I asked. I keep thinking about how different things could have been. If you just walked away like everyone expected you to. Is that what you wanted? For me to walk away? Part of me did, she admitted. It would have been easier than facing what I'd become. And now I realize I didn't want an easy husband. I wanted a strong one. I just didn't know how to handle strength when I finally saw it. I pulled into our driveway but didn't get out immediately. Your sister called me yesterday. My wife's head snapped toward me. What? Why didn't you tell me? Because it was my call to handle, not yours. What did she want? To apologize, to explain, to see if there was any way to fix things with the family. And what did you tell her? I told her that actions have consequences, that some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt, that she made her choice when she decided to disrespect my marriage and my home. My wife was quiet for a moment. Was she upset? She cried, begged, tried to blame you for everything, and I hung up on her. She still doesn't understand that this isn't about forgiveness. It's about consequences. She thought she could test boundaries that didn't exist, and now she's learned they very much do exist. We sat in the car for another few minutes, processing the weight of what had happened to our family. Do you think she'll ever understand? My wife asked. Probably not. People like her rarely do. They're too focused on what they want to see instead of the damage they caused getting it. I was like her, wasn't I? I turned to look at her fully. You were heading that direction, but you made a different choice when it mattered. Because you forced me to. No, because you chose to. I just made sure you understood what your options really were. We finally went inside, and as we got ready for bed, my wife stopped in front of the mirror. I look different, she said, studying her reflection. How so? Calmer, more settled. Like I know where I belong now. Where do you belong? She turned to face me with complete certainty. Here, with a man who knows his worth and won't let anyone, including his wife, forget it. I nodded approvingly. And how does that make you feel? Safe, she said without hesitation. For the first time in years, I feel completely safe. That night, as we lay in bed, she spoke into the darkness. Do you think other men would have handled this the way you did? Most men would have either exploded or walked away. They wouldn't have had the patience to orchestrate consequences. I'm glad you're not most men. So am I replied. Because most men don't get the satisfaction I got from watching your sister realize she'd bitten off more than she could chew. She laughed softly. That was pretty satisfying to watch. And that's how my marriage was saved. Not through counseling or compromise, but through a man finally standing up and demanding the respect he deserved. Sometimes the only way to fix a broken dynamic is to shatter it completely and rebuild it on better terms.